Hey, so, the funny thing is, Corey just reminded me of that. I remember him texting me that night when I was still on the floor at the NCAA championships. He's like, bro, you're on ESPN. In my head, I remember seeing the camera guy and in my head just thinking it was like the local news or something. We're like screaming and yelling and holding the trophy up. But no, it was on ESPN. So I remember thinking like, oh wait, this is a real moment right now. This is big time, So anyway, real quick too, before we give another hand for Travis Mash. What a wealth of knowledge. I like to think that I'm one of the guys that intuitively understands stuff. I can't understand, explain stuff the way that Travis does. So anytime I get to learn from a guy like that, I really appreciate it. And I hope you guys, really were able to absorb and take in a lot of what he had today. So I'm going to talk to you guys today about some, kind of life lessons I learned as a D1 strength coach. Man, that got a good ring to it, don't it? And let's look at this picture real quick. All right, so that's me and my guy, Johnny DeJulius. If you guys don't know who Johnny is, I was just showing some video of him. He's like a daredevil now. He goes all over the world with Logan Paul and Jake Paul and jumps off of planes and off of bridges and stuff. But anyway, he was on our national championship team at Ohio State. And that's one of my favorite pictures because it was a great moment with me and him on the floor, kissing the trophy. And every time I look at it, I still kind of think like, man, how did I end up there? How was I the guy that got to hold the trophy and kiss the trophy with my guys? The only team national title in Ohio State history. Because that wasn't always the plan. Even though now, like, being a strength coach, being a gym owner, I mean, it's all I've ever done, and it's all I'll ever do. This is just what I'm built for. But it wasn't always the plan of what I was going to do, right? I never was able to envision that someday that I would be on ESPN holding a trophy like that. And I will say, as Corey mentioned, he would always tell me, he would say, D, you're the best strength coach for wrestlers in the country. And he said he believed it way before I ever believed it. And so before I was even ever at Ohio State and I was just training a few, high school wrestlers at our old gym, he would be in my ear, telling me that you're the best. It was almost like he, spoken it into reality. And eventually I started to believe, but I think I would have never believed it if he didn't believe first. So that just kind of speaks to the importance of having, someone that believes in you. And so don't be afraid that when you believe in someone, don't be afraid to tell them because you never know the way it's going to affect them and the way it's going to, kind of help shape their life. So I know Corey's really helped shape a lot of you guys here today. Let's give Corey a hand real quick too. All right, so even though this wasn't the original plan for me, my original plan was going to be an English teacher. My undergrad degree from Ohio State is in English. And, as I put English to the side and became first a personal trainer and then a strength coach, it wasn't really until years later, number one, that I actually utilized my degree. I started writing ebooks. I have ebooks that have, strength conditioning for wrestling that are used all over the world. There's coaches in Mongolia and Russia and China and South America, everywhere that use my books to train their wrestlers. So I use my English degree in that way, kind of literally writing books. But also too, you think like as a teacher, what are the things that are so important? It's not just the X's and O's that you're teaching, from your lesson plan if you're an English teacher. It's not just the reps and sets and the technique that you teach as a strength coach. And the longer that I've been, in the industry and been around, athletes from the elite level to youth and everything, I started to realize the X's and O's, obviously that's very important because we got to get stronger, we got to get faster, we got to win wrestling matches. But I think a lot of the other things that I try to teach them along the way are even more important. The life lessons. Try to help shape them as hardworking individuals. Individuals that want to be leaders. Individuals that are not afraid of discomfort. Individuals that can be tough but are also compassionate and want to be helpful. Those are the type of things that I think are even more important and impactful. So I always tell parents when they first bring kids to me and when they trust me, with working with them in the gym, I always say, I'm going to get your kids stronger and they're going to win more wrestling matches and they're going to get in good shape. But we're going to learn things that are more important than that. We're going to teach them how to be tough and how to work, and that's going to transfer into everywhere in their life. So just as important as those things are for me to teach them, I've learned so much, from being a strength coach. It's really helped, shape me as well. So I'm going to kind of share with you the life lessons I learned as a D1 strength coach. Because it was a very, kind of impactful time in my life, early 30s up through my, around when I turned 40 when I was down there. All right. Lesson number 1, talent is not the separator. And if you look, that is my name on the side of that Big Ten ring right there. Kind of cool, right? Now, think about any elite organization, anywhere you've ever been. So whether we're talking about, a D1 sports program, talking about a Fortune 500 company, whether, your church, your family, any elite organization that operates well, there's a ton of talent, right? An organization cannot be elite without talent. But talent is usually not the separator. And I'll use the example again of Ohio State wrestling. If you look at their roster, all those guys that are in the starting lineup that are wrestling this weekend for Big Ten titles, those guys are the best of the best. They've been the best since they were very young. But there's guys third string behind them that were also great, right? There are guys that are multiple time state champs that'll never sniff the lineup. So why is that? They had talent. Maybe they were maybe even in high school they were better than some of those kids that are in the starting lineup that are wrestling at the Big Tens this weekend. So why are they not the ones? But it's because talent is not the separator. The little details are the separator. And I always say the ones who take every little detail serious, they don't leave anything up to chance throughout their day. I've had people ask me, they say, what did you notice was the difference down there between the guys that were wrestling in the Olympics or the guys that win the national titles and the guys that couldn't crack the lineup? And I'd say, well, it wasn't talent. It was the best guys would never go throughout their day just wondering what was going to happen or wondering, when they're going to eat lunch or what they're going to eat or what time they're training or what they have to do later in the day. They got a plan. You could ask Logan Stieber, say, hey, tomorrow, what are you going to have for lunch? He'd be able to tell you, I'm going to have 8 ounces of chicken. I need to have brown rice. I'm going to have some broccoli. I got to make sure I keep my weight under control. Okay, what time's your workout? Okay, I got the technique at 7. Got the team workout at 3:30. I'm going to do a weight cut. They know everything. They don't leave anything up to chance. So the guys that, take all those little details serious, those are the ones that make a difference. So you can kind of apply that to your own life and say, all right, I'm going to quit leaving little things up to chance. If I have these big goals, I got to think everything feeds into that. I got to make sure I'm taking everything serious. I need to know how much sleep I'm getting at night. I can't leave these things up to chance. And a great quote I learned from Kyle Snyder was an athlete that was down there. I think he was still probably has the record as the youngest Olympic champion in USA wrestling history. He won the Olympic title when he was there at Ohio State. And a quote from him, I remember he said, if someone could follow you around for 24 hours and you weren't allowed to speak, would they be able to guess what your goals are? And that really resonated with me because I thought, okay, it's one thing to stand up here and say, hey, my goals are to be the best strength coach, or my goals are to, for my gym to be the best gym or whatever. But if someone follows you around and watched your habits and really saw what you did throughout 24 hours, would they be able to guess and say, oh yeah, that guy wants to be the best strength coach, or that guy wants to, be the best husband he can be, or that guy wants to, build his car dealership to be the top one in the county, or whatever it is, So your actions have to be in alignment, and you can't leave things up to chance. All right, next slide. It's my first time ever running a PowerPoint too. All right, another one of my favorite pictures from my time down there. This is when, I get to serve as the honorary coach / honorary captain for dual meet. I think this was against Arizona State. So there's me out at the center mat. Got Coach Ryan, Coach Jaggers, and the other coaches right there, and the whole crowd was cheering for me. And so that was a really surreal moment too. Because I was not the type of athlete that would ever get to wrestle or compete in a sold-out arena like that and have everyone cheering for me. So to get everyone to cheer for me as a coach, that was a really special moment. And I know one of the the reasons that I got to be in that place, to stand in that position, wasn't because of the X's and O's that because I'm the smartest strength coach out there, or because I'm, on paper was the best or whatever. But one of the reasons was because I was so dependable. There's an old saying, I think it was an old hip hop saying, but we would always used to say when we were young, we'd say, word is bond, And, right? Your word is bond. If you say something, you got to mean it. If you say I'm going to do this, then you got to do it. If Trey asked me for help and I say, yeah, man, I'll come help you change your tire in your car. You can't show up an hour later. You can't say, oh man, I forgot I was supposed to help you. Your word has to be bond. Your dependability is going to be your number one asset over your talent and over your abilities, over anything else that you bring to the table. Because you could have great talent, you could have great skills that are valuable to that organization. But if they can't depend on you to be there, then you're not going to be an asset to them long term. And one of the things that stands out, I remember, maybe it was my second or third year there. It might have been the year after we won the national title, actually. And there was another strength coach at that time that I was kind of splitting time with. And I remember Coach Ryan was going to have to try to make a decision because, I started off as a volunteer down there. And then he was going to bring me on as kind of like the guy after volunteering for a couple years. And at the time, I was kind of, splitting time with another guy. And I remember he called me, and he didn't call me very often. We talked a lot when we were down there, but he called me on the phone. And I remember he said, hey, I got a decision to make, between you and this other guy. And listen, on paper, that other guy may have even been better. But I knew sometimes he was late. I always showed up early. I would get there an hour early and just work out, just in case there was a traffic jam or a wreck on the highway. I wouldn't leave it up to chance. I would leave 2 hours before it would start because it sometimes take about an hour to get there. Worst case, I get there an hour early, I do a workout. But I'd seen this guy be late a couple times. I saw him make excuses here or there. Even if on paper, maybe he was smarter than me. He'd been a way better athlete than me. But I knew they couldn't depend on him like he could depend on me. So I just, I didn't want to try to bash the guy or say anything. So I just said, Tom, I can tell you this. You're never going to have to wonder if I'm going to be there on time. You're never going to have to wonder if I'm going to show up and not give 100% for the athletes. I said, so that's all I can say. You know what you're getting with me. And I remember he just said, okay. He said, I got a decision to make. Got off the phone, and the next day, he sent the text. He's like, normal time, 9 a.m. So I knew I was in. So that's kind of the lesson there. If you can be ultra dependable, that can make up for some other shortcomings, right? Because we're not all perfect. We're all going to have things that we struggle with. But you can control, whether your word is bond or whether you're dependable or not. And that's a way you can kind of make up for some other shortcomings. Okay. Observations are more important than asking questions. All right, when you're around, and not that it's bad to ask questions. I don't want to frame this as, hey, you shouldn't ask questions. People say, well, how can I learn if I don't ask questions? Well, sometimes I think people, they ask questions, but then they almost don't even absorb the answer because they're thinking about their next question, right? So when I get an opportunity to listen to someone like Travis Mash, I want to just really soak it in. I'm not going to ask him a ton of questions, try to throw a question out there so that he knows that I kind of know what he's talking about and try to prove that I'm, as smart as him or whatever. Because that's what people do a lot of times when they ask questions around the elite. When I have the opportunity to learn from someone like that, I just want to observe. I want to try to soak it in. And that's what I did for a long time down at Ohio State. I'm going to say the most impactful thing for myself down there wasn't even just working with an Olympic champion or working with multiple-time national champions like Logan Stieber. It was the coaches' meeting. Every Monday, they would have a coaches' meeting. It would run from it would start at 10 a.m. Sometimes it'd run till 11. Sometimes it'd run till 12. Sometimes it went till 2 or 3 in the afternoon. And so all the coaches would come in, and they would always start with the strength training stuff first. And Tom would always say, hey, we'll knock your stuff out that way if you want to take off. I stayed for every one. I stayed for the whole thing. Because I thought, when am I going to get to be in the room with Terrell Delagnev, 2-time Olympian, Jay Jaggers, 2-time national champ, Lou Roselli, Olympian, Tom Ryan, future Hall of Fame coach for Ohio State. I got to sit there and, we would go over the strength and conditioning plan and kind of the training volume for the week and stuff. And after 20 or 30 minutes, I could leave if I wanted. I sat there for the whole thing every time. And I didn't ask a bunch of questions because a lot of it, not only was it over my head, but they didn't really need my contribution on, how much live they were going to do that week or, something about the starting lineup or whatever. But I wanted to just observe them and see how they operated, see how Tom would kind of manage the room. Because he wasn't, these guys were technically his subordinates, but you got Olympian, multiple-time national champ. You have so they're not, how do you manage guys like that who have their own ideas, their own egos, their own, concept of how things should be done? And there's going to be disagreements. Not everyone's always going to be on the same page. So that was my big thing is I would just sit there like a fly on the wall and just learn from them. And it wasn't always just about wrestling or just about, strength training. I learned a lot about just how to be a father, because at the time my kids were really young. My son had just been born, my daughter was 2. So I was learning about how to be a dad, how to juggle a busy schedule and family and, still being ambitious but still making time for your kids and, and also how to deal with other, strong personalities. I'd never really been in a corporate setting before. Me and Corey grew up lifting weights together. We've been best friends since we were young. We've always done things our own way. So we've never really had to listen to anyone other than each other, at the time he had Muscle Farm going on and, he was involved in that. But as far as like the way we operated in here in the gym, and even to some extent once, we started Max Effort, we really only had to answer it ourselves. So like now, I'm technically under this big umbrella that's a, very important institution that's the spotlight's on. So I really had to learn how to operate around guys like that where, it's not always going to be my way anymore, And you can ask G about this. I wasn't always good at when things weren't my way. I've gotten a lot better about that as I've gotten older. You learn to compromise and you learn to, not immediately dismiss someone else's opinion. You have to be able to kind of take a lot of different things into account and, kind of forge the best path forward for everybody. Now, if you guys were here last year, I had bronchitis last year and was coughing like crazy. It felt good to, to be healthy coming to this one. This is the most I've talked in a long time, so I might have a cough by the end of this too. All right. This was for, I think it was for our dual meet against Iowa. It was a throwback. They brought out the old robes. This is what they would wear in the 50s, for the warm-ups. They would wear these old robes, and these were the same ones. So they got to wear those. So that was really cool. So if you just look at this, you got my guy Colin Moore right there beside me, 4-time All-American. You got Kyle Snyder in there. Nathan Tomasello, 4-time Big Ten champ, one of the best ever. Bo Jordan, who's one of the coaches down there now. Miles Martin. These guys are the best of the best. And, a good lesson, I feel like it's something I already kind of intuitively knew, and this is why I was good at being a coach, is you got to know when to hug and you got to know when to yell. As a coach, especially when you're coaching elite athletes, you can't just be a yeller. You can't be, no one wants a drill sergeant. And if you think kids in the gym, high school kids, don't want a drill sergeant, wait till you're around guys like this that are the best of the best. And guys that even though they're 18, 19-year-old kids can probably whoop your ass. They don't, Not that I ain't tough, but these guys are real tough, So you can't be a drill sergeant. And on the, the opposite end of the spectrum, you got to know when to hug too. Just because these guys aren't tough doesn't mean that they don't need, an arm around them sometimes. And they don't need a shoulder to cry on, But you can't always just be that as well, You can't just be, the sounding board for them. You can't just be their best friend. You have to develop relationships with them. And you want to gain their trust, So you want, and, when you're around guys like this, you want them to think you're cool, right? Everyone wants to be accepted. Everyone wants to be cool. So when you're working with young athletes, you know what I'm saying, Travis. Yeah, you don't want them to look at you like, oh, you're just some old weightlifting guy. Yeah, you want to be accepted. You want to be cool, but you got to still be their coach first. You can't just focus on, being their best friend. I'll give you one quick example. I had an athlete one time, he reached out to me about, this is during the season, and this was actually a year or two after I left, but these were still my guys, So they're still guys that I worked with or whatever. And we still kind of had an agreement. The guys were still allowed to come out and work with me when they wanted to, during the season or the off season when stuff was optional. The option was you could do the optional Ohio State stuff. You could come out here to Coach Myers. And even during season, if they had guys that needed extra work or stuff that was outside of the scope of, what they had going on down there with their strength coach, they could come out to me. So it was a guy who I, was really tight with. He reached out to me and said, hey, Coach, I got to cut some weight. I talked to Tom. He said I could come out and do a boxing workout with you. I said, hey, man, that's perfect. I'm boxing with Braxton Miller. Not trying to name drop here, but I said, I'm boxing with Braxton Miller tomorrow at 9. I said, come on out. And he didn't show up for whatever reason. And so, I didn't think nothing of it. But me and Braxton got our little workout in. It was on my story or whatever. Well, I know later that day, right after I posted my story, I get a text from Tom. He said, hey, how was so-and-so at the boxing workout today? And I thought, that's not good. I didn't text him back right away. I was in the grocery store. I was in the market going through the line or whatever. About a minute later, I get a text from the guy who was supposed to come out and train with me. And he said, hey, sorry I wasn't able to make it out. He said, if Tom talks to you, just tell him I came out and boxed with you. I thought, oh, man. And this guy's my guy, right? I want him to think I'm cool. It's my buddy, you know? But I'm not going to lie for him. I'm not going to jeopardize my relationship with the program. So I just texted Tom back. I said, I don't know, man. I said, if he boxed today, I said, it wasn't with me. And he texted me back. He said, he didn't box with you. I said, he was not here with me. I said, I've been gone for the last 3 hours. You know, I didn't want to, you know, it's so embedded in me not to be a snitch, you know what I mean? You know what I mean? It's in my DNA, all right? I'm from Steubenville, like you just don't snitch. I just said, Tom, I said, he didn't work out with me in Braxton. I said, I left for lunch. I've been gone for 3 hours. He did not box with me. And then I called the guy back. I said, hey, man, I said, don't ever put me in that situation. I said, if you think I said, I love you, but if you ever think I'm going to jeopardize my relationship with Coach Ryan and with the program because you didn't want to come out for a workout, I said, you're crazy. And I thought right then, I said, all right, if this kid doesn't ever talk to me again, it just is what it is. And right then, he just apologized. And he knew he was wrong, you know. So I'm glad I didn't give in to, you know, my non-snitch instincts, you know what I mean? So sometimes you got to hug, sometimes you got to yell, but never snitch. You can snitch in a roundabout way if you got to. Okay. Am I doing all right on time? All right. I'll make these last couple short. Be realistic about where you fit. You know, be realistic about where you fit, you know, in any organization. And not just you personally, but also what you're doing, the order of importance. Something I really had to learn real quick when I got down there was on the scale of things, my strength workouts I was doing with the team, especially when they got in season, it was low on the totem pole. In my mind, it was number one. It was the most important thing. But, you know, these guys got live matches. They got their weight cut. They got, you know, I couldn't do anything with them that was going to adversely affect what they did on the mat. I had to add to it, not take away from it. And at first, a lot of what I was doing was taken away from it because I had my ego attached to it. Not only would I train them, but I would train with them. I had to prove to them I was tough. I had to prove to them I could make the hardest workouts in the world. And so I would want to bury them every day. And the workouts were great, you know, from a fitness standpoint and from a strength standpoint. But sometimes, you know, we'd work out at 7 a.m. or 6 a.m. or whatever time they would come in season, and they would have to wrestle matches at 3 p.m. They'd say, Coach, my legs are still gone. You know, if you've ever wrestled before, if your legs are gone, you can't wrestle, you know. So it took me a while. Honestly, it probably took me a year or two to start, like, kind of pull my ego away from it and say, you know what, my work that I'm doing with them, even though it's very important, it is not as important as I think it is. It's not as important to them or to the coaches as it is to me. So you got to be realistic about where you fit. You know, it's human nature for you to think your own contributions are the top priority. But if you can take your ego out of that and, you know, be realistic about your contributions and about what you're doing, you're going to be just more effective and more valuable in general, because now you're really working towards the common good of whatever that organization is, and not just the good of, oh, I want my workouts to be bangers. You know what I mean? And continuing along that, this is a good lesson for everyone. The show goes on. So this was, I think it was at the NCAAs. This was my last year really running the strength program. You know, we'd won it. That first picture of us kissing the trophy. And then we got second. I think maybe we went first, and then fifth, and then second, then second. And so this was the last year we were runners-up. We'd won the Big Ten 2 weeks prior, and then got second in the NCAAs. Just down there on the floor. The guys, even kids, I'm still really happy. You know what I mean? But the guys, they're kind of bummed out looking, you know, because we'd beat Penn State, you know, 2 weeks before, and they thought we'd beat them that week, and they didn't. But, you know, the show goes on. And we had a really great run. And at the time, I remember thinking, like, man, I'm going to be immersed in this and involved in this forever. This is, you know, I'm not upset that we only got second. I'm going to be down here till I'm 60. Like, hey, I'm on ESPN with my guys, with my team. You start to tie your identity to things. You start to tie your identity to accomplishments, you know? Oh, I'm the OSU strength guy. I'm the max effort guy. I'm the old school gym. I'm the gym owner, you know? People might see me around town and they might say, oh yeah, that's the max effort guy, or that's the wrestling guy. Or they see Corey and they're probably like, that's the guy who drives the Rolls Royce, you know? It's a thing. That's not Corey, it's something he drives, right? But that's probably what they say. Or they'll say, yeah, well, that's the gym guy, the supplement guy. We tie our identities to these things. And it might be what we do, but it's really not us, right? That was something I did, something I was a part of, but it's still really not me. That was a time in my life. Anyone here ever listen to Alan Watts? Anyone know who Alan Watts is? We got a lot in common. All right. Alan Watts, great philosopher. If you want to think big picture about the world and life, if you like listening to philosophy, look at it. They got tons of Alan Watts stuff on Instagram or on YouTube. But there's a great lecture that he does, and he talks about how in 100 years, everyone you know, that you've ever known, that you've ever met, they're all going to be dead. They're all going to be in the ground, buried beside you. Strangers are going to live in your house that you worked so hard to build. And everything you've ever owned, this, even the pictures of you, they're in the dustbin somewhere. You know what I mean? They're gone. Now, a little bit different now with the internet. Some stuff on the internet's forever. But the concept's still the same. The show moves on, These things that we get so tied to. I love my house. Spent years building it. I never want to leave on the weekends. Someday there's going to be a stranger living in it. I hope it's like my great-great-great-grandson or something like that. But the reality is it's probably going to be someone that doesn't know who I am, Someone that doesn't know I was the wrestling guy, So when you think about these things that you place so much importance in your life, whether it's things or jobs or accomplishments, just remember, someday the show goes on. Once I left Ohio State, I remember thinking like, oh my God, that team's going to be so different without me, and they're going to miss me so much. And yeah, maybe some of the guys miss me a little bit. The show goes on, They're wrestling at the Big Tens this weekend, the number 2 team in the country. They're still great, and that's okay. That's good. The show went on without me, as it should. And just like for all of you guys, these things that you hold dear to you, whether it's your job or, athletes that you're involved with or whatever, someday they'll still be talking about Travis Mash, but then eventually it'll get to a point, the athletes, the sons of those athletes, they might not know you, you know what I mean? So it's a good lesson to learn, and, I think the younger you can learn that in life, the better, because it'll really help you focus on the things that's important to you. And the most important things are the things that are important that are right in front of you today, in days like today, right? Thanks, that's all I got for you.